this car kind of comes swerving, careening down the road, pulls in, and Erica like stumbles out of the car like red-faced drunk with safety pins all over her face, like pushed through her eyebrow and her lip and her ears. I was like, what? What is this? It was St. Patrick's Day weekend, and she'd been out with some friends downtown and had gotten drunk that night and stuck a bunch of safety pins through her face. So I was like, all right, well, that's interesting. Let's go to breakfast. I'm going to do something a little different today. I'm going to sit. And it's not because I'm envious of the cool megachurch preachers. I do want to be a little more relaxed. I'm going to lean into my grandfather role a little bit today and tell stories.
All right.
Let's see if we can do this. There we go. I do want to start with a scripture reading though. Well, I spend a lot of my time anymore these days talking about teachings and doctrines, and I get involved in a lot of institutional dynamics and church planting and that kind of stuff, and sometimes I feel a little like disconnected from the human side of our Christianity. Like I spend a lot of time in the doctrinal, intellectual side of Christianity, and it's good to remember our identity and who we are as people. Very few of you know me. You know Christian Matthew, but you don't know Matthew. And so I want to tell some stories about where I come from. I want to give my testimony in kind of a longer form that I don't have a lot of opportunity to do, and it seemed good to me this week to do that. But before I do, I want to read Romans chapter 6. I think I'll just read the end. I really love this chapter. It's a good one to memorize if you're ever looking for something to memorize. It talks a lot about, like, there's obvious connections to baptism in Romans 6 because baptism is a process that's being described from a doctrinal perspective of what it does to us and how we identify with Christ's death and enter into new life and resurrection power. But the way that he describes that is comparing and contrasting where we come from and where we are in Christ. And he says some really beautiful things in here, especially at the end. He says, starting like at verse 12, "Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that you should..."
When the king had commanded.
That's okay. "That you should obey it in the lust thereof. Neither yield ye your members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto God, as those that are alive from the dead. Amen. And your members, your parts of your body, as instruments of righteousness unto God." God wants to play us like a piano for righteousness. "For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law, but under grace. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law, but under grace? God forbid. Know you not that to whom you yield your members, yourselves servants to obey, you yield yourselves servants to obey, his servant you are, to whom you obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. But God be thanked that ye were the servants of sin, but ye have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered you. Being then made free from sin, you became the servants of righteousness. I speak after the manner of men because of the infirmity of your flesh. For as you have yielded your members servants to uncleanness, unto iniquity, even so now yield your members servants to righteousness unto holiness. For when you were servants of sin, you were free from righteousness. What fruit had you then in those things whereof you are now ashamed? For the end of those things is death. But now, being made free from sin, and become servants to God, you have your fruit unto holiness, and the end everlasting life. For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. I have a thing that I say in my family all the time. I say it openly to my brothers, especially, that I'm my mother's good son, and she usually corroborates that. I was a very conscientious child growing up. I was interested in the Bible. I was interested in religious literature. I was good at memorizing the scriptures. I took more than an average interest in church things. My grandfather was a preacher. My grandfather was an Italian immigrant, and he immigrated with his family into Detroit, and all of my Italian family became Baptists because of they had. Their father had been raised Catholic in Italy and was converted, and all my grandfather, my great aunts and uncles all grew up in Italian-speaking Pentecostal churches in the Detroit area. And all my grandfather and my great uncles went off to the Second War. They were naturalized in order to join the war. And when they came back, they were irreligious. They didn't do anything with themselves. But their sisters had started going to a kind of a famous Baptist church called Detroit Baptist Tabernacle. And my grandfather was converted there, and his siblings were as well. And they were serious. My great aunts and uncles, many of them went into the ministry. My grandfather was one of those men, and he went to seminary school in Texas and met my grandmother, who was very not Italian, and Dorothy. She was a Texas girl. And they only ever had one son, my father. My grandfather started a church in Ohio, in Findlay, Ohio, and he preached there for 56 years before he retired. And I grew up moving around a lot. My father was in manufacturing when I was young, when I was a baby. And we moved around a lot. We left Ohio when I was a baby and moved to two different places in Texas where my father worked. And then we moved, those places went out of business, and my father lost his job. And we moved to Southern California. And so I grew up in Ventura, California, mostly. It's a really cool little beach town in Southern California. And we went to a Baptist church, which for Southern California was rather conservative, but within the sphere of fundamental independent Baptists was not very conservative. But we were serious. My first few grades of school were at the Baptist school, private school, and my father was a trustee and a deacon and on the school board, and we were in church 3 times a week, and we never missed an event, and we were there twice on Sunday and every Wednesday, and we were faithful people. I as a child was not I was a little bit different than my peers. I didn't particularly like children. I remember going to Sunday school, and they would, in Sunday schools in the evangelical church, you sing the songs, you clap your hands, you turn around. And I didn't want nothing to do with that. I thought it was the stupidest thing from the time I was his age, smaller. I was too, I don't know, proud or what. I just thought that was foolishness. I didn't want anything to do with it. I was kind of a serious young child. We were politically motivated as a family. I mean, my dad wasn't running for offices or anything, but we were very Republican. Talk radio, always voted. We knew who we were, and that fit very well within our church identity. And they were mixed together. Church and politics were together, very much so. So I grew up in kind of a pretty moral for Southern California, conservative for evangelical Baptist home. I remember, we used to go to Awanas when I was a kid, and that was like Boy Scouts for church people, kind of. We'd memorize scriptures and then play games. And I would memorize scriptures, but I didn't want to play the games. I would go sit in the office with the old lady and file papers because I liked adults more than children generally. And so that's kind of where I come from. I was growing up as kind of a serious young man. By the time I was a young teenager, we were just starting to get in trouble. I was about 14, 15 years old, and my buddies started drinking. Some of them started driving, and then we could go to parties and stuff. And I was just with my parents. My brother was ordained a couple weeks ago, and I went out to his ordination, and my parents were there, and we did some talking about the past. And my parents feel guilty. When I was 15, my dad took a position that led us out of Southern California and into Central Oregon. And it was a very traumatic move for me. I had my whole childhood and growing up was in Southern California, and all my buddies were there, and we were just starting to drive, and we were just starting to have fun. And I remember the evening my parents sat the whole family down and said, we're moving to Oregon. I was like, Oregon? I barely even know that's a state. Like, where is Oregon? And I remember this is pre-internet days. I had encyclopedias in my room, and I went and pulled the encyclopedia out of my set for Oregon, and the first thing I saw is the Beaver State. And I was like, the Beaver State? What in the world? What kind of hillbilly backwater are my parents moved me into from Southern California? So needless to say, I wasn't very excited about moving. And when I got there, it was very hard for me to make friends. I don't know why that is. It's just that age and high school, and it's hard, and new place and everything else. When I look back at my years at that time, I mean, middle school was atrocious. I hated middle school. I hated being in school. I didn't mind the education stuff. I just hated the social environment. And high school was just as bad, if not, well, it wasn't quite as bad. I had some friends by then. But I never really felt like I fit in anywhere. I was a smart kid, but I didn't get along with like the nerdy people. And I was into sports and I wrestled, but I didn't really fit in with the jocks. And like, I just didn't have anywhere that I fit. Like, I was just kind of an oddball in any group where I was. I could kind of move anywhere between here or there, but I never really had people that were close at that point in my life. And the easiest people to make friends with were the people that you probably shouldn't make friends with, the party kids. And so not long after I moved into Oregon, I started falling in Oregon. It's the stoners. So I started smoking dope and hanging out at parties. And my senior year of high school then I was ahead of credit, so it was very easy for me to get through school. And to be quite honest, public school is a racket. Like, if you learn how to play the game, it's not even hard. You don't have to try. Like, I would never show up to class. I would just show up on the days when there was a test and read the bold sentences in the chapter that week and ace it every time and go on with my happy life. And so I spent my entire senior year stoned out of my head and graduated with a 3.5 average GPA. During that time, I think I was just looking for acceptance, looking for people to belong to, and a good time. Like, I just was like a good American kid. One of the biggest scams I pulled in high school, aside from stealing an office out of a chair out of my principal's office, was that I talked them into letting me start a class. I convinced the school to let me start a philosophy class for seniors, which was really just me and my buddies smoking weed and hanging out and talking like stoners. I don't know why they went for it. I have no idea to this day, but it passed. He was like, okay, sure, try it. So I had a class with all my buddies And that's exactly what we would do. And we'd go sit out in the tennis courts. We'd hang out together. And the principal would come in every week or so and say, hey, what's going on in here? And we'd say something that sounded smart, and then he would leave, and we'd go on with our whatever we were doing. And that group of friends, one day we were out in the tennis courts, and my friends brought a girl along, a girl I'd never met before. She wasn't at my school, and a girl like I'd never seen before. She was very different than anybody I'd known before. She was almost bald, very small, and looked tough as nails. And I was intrigued by her. I thought she was like, who's this? What's this? What's going on here? Erica had been living on the streets already for, probably a year at that time. And I'm not going to tell all her story. That's for another time. But she had run away for good at the time she was 15. And when she ran away, the first group of people that she linked up with were white power skinheads in Salem, which is an hour north of where I lived. And she was different, and she was tough as nails. And some situations happened where she ended up on her own. And I'll tell you one story just to set the context for who Erica was when I met her. She got dropped off. Things went crazy up in Salem with the gang that she was running with. She was 15. Last school was in 7th grade, beginning of 7th grade. And so there she was on the streets. She'd run away with a friend. She'd been in this gang. A bunch of crazy stuff happened. Everybody got split up and busted up, and cops took some people away. And she was on her own, and she got dropped off at a concert in Eugene. Concerts are like church for skinheads. It's where all the social events happen. It's where you communicate information. It's where you make plans. It's the closest thing that group has to like a central meeting. And they're very, very, very territorial. And they're kind of the city that a concert is in kind of runs the domain of that place. Like, you don't show up unless you're invited, unless you're from that town and you're from those gangs. So she didn't know what the scene was. She thought there was some white power people in Eugene, but this show was very much not. It was the opposite crowd. And this is a very, very dangerous scenario. Like, people get maimed and killed in this environment. So there are other things like, I was always fascinated in Lancaster County, how gang-like Lancaster County is. You can tell what gang somebody's from in Lancaster County by the size of covering they wear or the cut of dress they wear. And it's very much that way with the skinheads. Like, you can tell by how people dress. It's very subtle, but if you're in that culture, it's as clear as a neon sign. You know exactly who people are and where they're coming from by the way they look. And again, if you're from that culture, you know it. Like, you can walk around in Walmart and Ephrata and pick out which church people go to based on how they look, and it's the same kind of thing there. So she walks into a show at Iggy's Tea House, and immediately everybody knows she doesn't belong, and immediately everybody knows she's all alone. And so a crowd gathers around her, and it's a very intimidating scenario. And the message is, this is your last chance, get out. She had one friend there, one person that she knew, and she went up to him as this crowd was assembling and asked if he had any weapons, and he didn't have anything to help her. And so she stood there as this crowd gathers around her. 15-year-old, probably 85 pounds soaking wet, as a crowd of skinhead gathers around her, and they say, you need to leave. And she says, no, I paid my money to get in here. I'm not going anywhere. And this is how these people act. That's almost expected behavior, but it's also expected that somebody's going to get hurt. And so somebody there has the presence of mind to say, hold on a second, guys. This is a very young girl. she probably has no idea what's going on. And so they stopped for long enough to start talking to her and say, well, who are you? And why are you here? And what's your story? And where are you coming from? And who do you know? And they started asking all these questions, and they decide at that point that she's not the threat that she appears to be, that she's just a misguided young girl. They take her in, and they take her up to Portland. Now, this is a rival gang. There's a lot of dangerous stuff happening in these crossing of paths. Erica's family doesn't know where she's at for these years. This year, we're about a year at this point, and so they wonder, but they don't. They know that she's with a bad crowd, so nobody pursues too far. She ends up in Portland, and this gang has some connections to people in Eugene that happen to be coincidental friends of mine. So it's like friends of friends of friends situations. And that's what brings her to my school this day. Friends of friends. There's another situation that happens in Portland. She gets arrested. She goes home, and she tells her mom, "I'm not staying here." That's the one night she was home after she was 15. She tells her mom, "I'm not staying here." And her mom says, "Okay, you just come home for the night, and I'll take you wherever you want to go tomorrow. But I'm not going to take you back to those people." And she says, "Okay, I know some people in Eugene that I can stay with." And so these people that she knew of in Eugene, that's the network of friends that I'm familiar with. And so they bring her to my school, and everybody introduces her, and she's going to have a welcome to Eugene party with some people that I know. And so I show up at this party, and it's a lot of fun, and we're all hanging out and drinking. And Eric and I kind of connect that night, and I tell her, "Hey, can I take you out sometime?" And so she's like, "Yeah, sure, whatever." And so at this point, she's hard to get. At this point, my parents went to a very big church in downtown Eugene, but my wrestling coach went to a little country church, and so I had talked my parents into letting me go to a different church than they did, because it was my wrestling coach that was the youth pastor there. And they allowed. Things were already rocky with me, and so I think they were just glad that I wanted to go somewhere, so they let me go. But usually what I did is I would just put on a suit Sunday morning and take my dad's car and go have coffee. And so this Sunday, I told Erica that at that party, I said, "Hey, I'll pick you up Sunday morning. We'll go have breakfast." And she's like, "Okay, great." So I drove out from my parents' place. I'm in my suit. I'm in my dad's Explorer. He's got a car phone. It's super swank. This is like top of the line stuff. I'm looking good. This is gonna be all right. So I drive in to the house where she's staying, and I go up and I knock on the door, and I said, "Hey, is Erica here?" And she could tell that I was all dressed up, and it was the lady that Erica was living with, and she said, "Oh, honey, I'm sorry, she's not home. She hasn't been here for 2 nights." And I was like, "Oh, really?" And I was kind of bummed, and I was like, "Okay, well, tell her I stopped by." And I turn around to leave, and this car kind of comes swerving, careening down the road, pulls in, and Erica like stumbles out of the car, like red-faced drunk, with safety pins all over her face, like pushed through her eyebrow and her lip and her ears. I was like, "What? What is this?" It was St. Patrick's Day weekend, and she'd been out with some friends downtown and had gotten drunk that night and stuck a bunch of safety pins through her face. So I was like, "All right, well, that's interesting. Let's go to breakfast." So I took her to the old pancake house on 11th Street, and I was super nervous, and I was super awkward, especially around girls. And I didn't know what to even say to this girl. Here's something interesting though. I was not a ladies' man, not by any stretch. I'd never really had a girlfriend. I was just an odd duck. And I remember thinking when I was driving from my parents' house out to where Erica was staying, I remember having this weird thought in my head. I thought, wouldn't that be crazy? Wouldn't that be wild if this girl ended up, like, if I ended up marrying her? That would be wild. Like, how weird would that be if this was, like, the first girl I meet is somebody I ended up marrying? I don't know where that came from. I don't know why I was thinking that way. Like, I just met her the one time. I wasn't prone to that kind of fanciful. It's not like I'd had those thoughts about anybody before. It was just something that struck me as I was driving up there. And then I know what, then I just forgot about it. Well, I didn't forget about it. It stuck in the back of my head for a long time. So now we're at the pancake house, and my sister had, her roommate happened to walk into this pancake house. And so I sat and talked to Kathy the whole time I was on a date with Erica, because I knew how to talk to Kathy. I didn't know how to talk to Erica. And she must have thought, who knows what, who is this guy? Take me on a date and hang out with some other woman. So I took her home, and we started hanging out then together more and more. It was my senior year, and I started spending more time with her friends than with my friends, her inner circle than my inner circle. And it wasn't long until I became more and more interested in her circles than mine. And I wanted to be a part. I had obviously never been around gang culture before, and I was fascinated by a lot of things. I was not a violent person. So I wrestled in high school. I was a wrestler, but I wasn't particularly good at it. I'm not really built like a wrestler. I never was. It was too long and lanky. And one thing my coaches always told me when I was in high school wrestling is that you just don't have that killer instinct. You don't have that thing that makes you want to win. Like, you give up too easy. And it made me not a good wrestler. So I wasn't a violent person. I wasn't aggressive at all. But I started hanging out with these friends, and they were tough, and they were cool, and they were whatever. But more than that, I could tell that they were really connected. They really, like, they were community is what it came down to. Like, that's one way to say it. And I was fascinated by that. And I felt like I fit in so I tried really hard to be like them, to fit in that circle. And there's a lot of barriers to entry. And I think that was probably made it more interesting, not less. Erica asked me one time, I started dressing more like them. And I remember showing up one time at a place where everybody was at, and Erica's like, "Why are you dressed like that?" I was like, "Dressed like what?" And she said, "Why are you dressing like a skinhead?" First of all, you don't just do that. Like, you don't just start dressing like a gang. Like, you have to come in through the door. You have to earn your way in. So it was dangerous, but more, I think the reason she liked me is because I was different than that initially. And she had enough tough guys around, and she liked somebody who was a little nicer and a little less broken. But I eventually made my way into that scene, and Eric and I spent, this would have been 1996. I graduated finally that year, but before I graduated, I was spending most of the time I would either stay with Erica at her house, or I would leave my house at 1 a.m. and not come back, and I was in and out of my own house. I remember going back home for my graduation party, and I took a bunch of skinheads to my parents' house, and my poor parents, they just didn't have any idea what to do with me. I remember talking to him once, and my dad said, "What are you doing? Like, what is this?" And I was like, "No, Dad, you don't understand. They're good people, and they're all tight, and it's all right." And he's like, "No, it's not all right." My dad kind of just shut me out then, and I think they both kind of did. They didn't know what to make of what I was doing, and I was 18, and you know how it is. Like when you're 18, you're just supposed to go do your own thing, and that's kind of where they were at. So I moved out, and I moved in with Erica. But shortly after that, we left. We left that place and were homeless, and we would just go from party to party and place to place and hang out on the streets or walk for miles to somewhere where we could crash on a couch or stay with friends. So a lot of fighting, a lot of drinking, a lot of foolishness. But Erica and I were unique in some ways, 2 ways in particular. I didn't know how old she was, for one, for a long time. I remember one night we were all drinking in a park at 1 o'clock in the morning, and the cops pulled into the park, and they lined everybody up, and they took everybody's information, and they were having everybody read off their date of birth down the line. And it's like, Eric and I were at the end, and it's like their birth dates were like 72, 76, 74, and it got to me, and I said, my birthday is 1/20/78, and everybody looked down the line, 78? You're that young? And then Erica said 12/10/80, and everybody's like, 80? You were born in 1980? I had no idea you were that young. I didn't know how young she was, because when I met her, she was a street kid. She'd already been on the streets for a year, and so I didn't, it's not like a, hi, how are you? How old are you? When's your birthday? So, so we were unique in that we were in a much older gang. Can you tighten that up?
It's going to tip. I have my phone.
Okay. We were we can rest it right there. That'll work. We were in an older gang with older people, as you can tell from that story, but we were younger, right? So we were the youngest in an old gang, and these gangs, they have a very short generation. Like, you hang out in these spaces for a few years, and then you either go to jail or you grow up and quit being stupid enough to get in fights all the time, and you go on with your life. So, 4 years is a long career as a skinhead. And that's what happened in our gang, is that people generally kind of like moved on with their life, or went to jail, or just disappeared. And as a new crowd came into our gang, Eric and I were as old as the people that were there, but we were part of the old crew. And so we had like a lot of clout. Like, we were part of the old crew and they were the new crew, even though they were all the same age. And there weren't that gang wasn't involved in criminal enterprise or anything. We were just, it was kind of like a white trash version of West Side Story. Like, it was just a neighborhood gang. Like, we would go to parties and we would fight and we would whatever, but it wasn't, we were just buddies that all hung out together and took care of each other. And time went on. I finally proposed to Erica in, I think, the beginning of 98. I asked her to marry me. When we were first dating, I told her I never want to get married and never want to have kids. So much for that. I think I was just trying to be edgy. But I proposed to her in the beginning of 1998, and we had been together for a couple years then. And that's the other thing, is that long-term couples aren't really a thing. Everybody kind of like trades boyfriends and girlfriends in that scene. Another thing about that scene was that there weren't, women weren't really considered generally a part of the gang. Women are kind of like, they're girlfriends, they're connected, but they're not usually skinheads. And if they are, they're not really accepted as a part of the gang, except for 2 girls in our crew. One was Erica and another was an older girl. And no, if you were to ask on the streets where's Matt, everybody'd be like, I don't know, what are you talking about? If you would ask where's Erica, but if you said where's Matt and Erica, everybody knew exactly who you were talking about. We were always together. And so I proposed in 1998. I should tell you how Shane and Mary fit in this story. We met them back then. They had some mutual friends, and we got in a fight at a punk rock house with a bunch of punkers that night, and Shane had been there that evening. I won't tell all the details of that story, but we had crossed paths. Like we had beat up some of his friends. That's where we first connected with them. And then Mary, see, we were homeless, and so we would always sit at IHOP, because at IHOP you could buy a cup of coffee for $1 and sit there all day. It's a bottomless cup of coffee. So if it was raining or gross outside or late or early or cold or whatever, you could scrounge up $1 and go sit at IHOP for 3, 4, 5 hours if you wanted to, till they ran you off or whatever. And so we would always hang out at IHOP, and Mary happened to be a hostess at IHOP. And so Mary came in one time. She was always nice to us, but she was just somebody. Like she wasn't anybody to us. It was just the lady that worked at IHOP. And she came in one time, and she had a really nice pair of boots on. And Erica's like, "Did you see those boots?" I was like, "Yeah." She's like, "You think they would fit me?" I was like, "I think so." She's like, I'm going to take them." I was like, "All right, we'll hit her up outside when she leaves work. You can tax her boots." And we were going to do that. And that night, my car broke down, and I couldn't get to work. And I was sitting at IHOP. Eric and I worked opposite shifts. We had an apartment by this time. It was close to the IHOP, and we worked opposite shifts. She would ride her bike. She was working as a CNA at an old folks home, and I was working at a steel mill. And my car was broken. I couldn't get to work, and so I was at IHOP trying to figure out what to do. And Mary's boyfriend Shane, who had a big long ponytail, a big greasy ponytail, not the kind of people I would typically hang out with back then. He was there. He was the only one there, and I was telling him, "I don't know what I'm doing. I got to get to work." And he's like, "Well, I can give you a ride." I was like, "Really? You give me a ride?" He's like, "Yeah, sure, I'll give you a ride." So then he went and told Mary, who was working, because he would hang out there while she was working. He went and told Mary, "Hey, I'm going to give that guy a ride." She's like, "Who?" He's like, "That guy." And she's like, "He's going to kill you." And he's like, "Nah, it'll be all right." And then he came back and he was like, "Oh no, I think this guy's going to kill me." So I hung out together. He gave me a ride to work, and then the next night, Eric and I were together there, and we were talking about taxing her boots, and I was like, "No, don't do that. Her boyfriend's cool. He gave me a ride to work." She's like, "He what?" "Yeah, he's really funny. He gave me a ride to work, and he made me laugh the whole time." And she's like, "All right, you weirdo." So we didn't tax Mary's boots, and we started hanging out with them. They ended up moving in with us at our apartment, and then I should tell a couple other things about that time. It happened to be that a lot of the people that we hung out with, especially the girls at that point, were into witchcraft. And I don't know. Sometimes I think people think that sounds crazy. Like, are people really into witchcraft? In Oregon, they are. Oregon's a place with a lot of witchcraft. People are really like neo-pagan, Wiccan, Satanist. Like, there's a lot of occult in Oregon. And so it wasn't that surprising. Like, especially in subcultures, everybody's into something occultic. And so a lot of the girls were into witchcraft. And so when we would have a party, all the girls would go in the back and mess around with Ouija boards and do weird occult stuff. And all of us would sit in the front of the room and drink beer, play video games or something stupid. And I at that point in my life, I would have told you that I was a Christian. And that seems insane to me now. But I was very sincere about it. What I meant by that was that from growing up, I never had a moment. I don't know if I've ever had a moment of doubt in my life that Jesus Christ was God in the flesh incarnate, that he lived a perfect life, that he did miracles, that he died on the cross for my sins and rose again on the third day. As long as I've ever known that story, I've believed it to be true. I never really had a phase of my life where I went through like doubt about those facts of the gospel. They just were self-evident to me because I learned them growing up. And so I felt like from from the poor doctrine that I was taught, like the sinner's prayer, eternal security, ask Jesus into your heart, that form of Christian conversion, I had done at 5 years old. And I had gone through those steps, and I believed that Jesus was the Son of God, that he lived a perfect life, so died on the cross for my sins, and rose again on the third day. And that's what makes you a Christian. So the differentiation between a Christian and a heathen is someone who believes those things are true is a Christian, and someone who doesn't believe those things are true is a heathen. So that's the only distinction there was to be made. And since I believed those things were true, the rest of my life was immaterial. The fact that I was a drunken, carousing, brutalizing, fist-fighting skinhead didn't affect my Christianity because I still believed that premise was true. I think that there's a lot of people in that category. I think a lot of people in the evangelical world live in that space. I don't think a lot of people are as brutal and horrible as I was. Some are. But a lot of people think that their life is disconnected from their faith. And that's a heritage of the Reformation. So when all the girls were into all this occult stuff, I would tell Erica, y'all are crazy. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't mess with that stuff. It's not right. I think for her, this is my assumption. She's never told me this, but I think that the pursuit of the occult was a spiritual version of the pursuit of power that we like. When Erica was young, she was hurt, and she left home saying, "I'm not going to let anybody hurt me again," and that's how she ended up in street gangs. And she ran with very, very strong, very dangerous, very violent people, but nobody was going to hurt her again. At least if they were, it was going to be on her terms. And I think that the pursuit of the occult was similar. It was something about power. It was something about not feeling vulnerable or weak, and a way to manipulate supernatural things the way that she manipulated physical power. I think that's probably what calls a lot of people to the occult, feelings of powerlessness. Is it's a way of manifesting something in your life that's more than you, without the moralism and discipline that's required through religion. And so things started to get weird, really weird. Things started moving around the house and sounds and things. And as that stuff would happen, I'd be like, hey, that's her deal, not mine. It don't got nothing to do with me. I'm a Christian. If you want to play with that stuff, that's on you. It's bad juju. Don't do it. But that's on you, man. But then I was home alone one night, and I was sitting on my couch, and it was like I was sitting on my couch, and the living room was where you entered the house, and there was a long hallway. And I was sitting on my couch, and it was like somebody took my Zippo lighter and was standing in the middle of the hallway and threw it in the middle of the room. I was just sitting on my couch, and my lighter comes flying in the room. So I jump up and run into the hallway, try to figure out what's going on. Nobody, nowhere, nothing. And I'm like, what is this about? And I remember I spent like 15 minutes like setting my Zippo up on the edge of the entertainment center and seeing if I could get it to fall into the middle of the room. Like, how did this happen? I can't believe this happened. I don't know if I told Eric about that back then. It freaked me out though, because nobody was there, and this stuff isn't, I'm a Christian, this stuff isn't supposed to have nothing to do with me. And then the next event that happened was I was at IHOP with a friend of mine who was living with us. And we were talking about these crazy girls messing around with all this occult and witchcraft and stuff. And he mentioned the name of one of the familiar spirits that they had been talking to. And the salt shaker slid across the table and fell off the table in a crowded IHOP restaurant. And that really freaked me out, like, because it wasn't at home, nobody was there but me and Robert, and this stuff's happening in public. Like, that's a whole different step. remember we used to sit and drink. It's the middle of summer, we'd have the door and all the windows open, and all of a sudden the whole room would just go cold, like you could see your breath cold. Our atheist friends got to the place where they're like, I'm not coming to your house anymore. It's too weird. And I didn't know what to make of all that. I just knew it freaked me out. And at this point, soon after this point, Erica and I, we asked Shane and Mary to move out because we were going to get married. And we finally married in August of 98. And our wedding was a trip. Had a giant Irish dude show up in a kilt and leather gauntlets, and my dad flew in, and it was like the mafia was walking in one door and the Irish kilt guy was walking in the other door, and like every kind of riffraff you can imagine at my wedding. It was in Erica's grandmother's backyard. And we were gonna, my car, I had this little BMW and I was always working on it. It was a 76 BMW 2002. I was always working on that thing and I couldn't ever get it run. And Shane and I had just replaced the clutch that week in that car. And I needed to get it working because we were going to take it for my honeymoon at our wedding. And we were working on that thing till 1 o'clock in the morning the night before I got married. And finally gave up and just took Shane's car up to the wedding. Erica was worried I wasn't going to show up. I was late to my own wedding. And so we didn't have anything to do. I had a buddy that had flown in from California that was in my wedding party. And after the wedding was over, I didn't know what to do. I didn't have a car, so I told Shane, "Well, you're going to take Shion up to Portland for to leave in the morning at the airport. So we'll go out by the coast, and you can drop me and Erica off at a hotel somewhere on the coast, and we'll stay a couple nights, and you can come pick us up. We'll just hang out on the beach." And so we drove over to the coast and drove all the way up to the Washington border. There wasn't a single vacancy in all the hotels all the way up the coast, the 101. And so that didn't work. That's the kind of forethought and planning I had in my life at that point. We were just kids. She was 17 and I was 20. And after we were married, I remember shortly after we were married, I remember having a conversation with Erica about whether or not what we were going to do about being skinheads. Like, how long are we going to do this for? Because, like, it's not you just get tired of it, is what comes down to. You get tired of always being on call, like on call for violence, on call, waiting for somebody to call and say, "Hey, I'm down at a bar and I need to get in a fight with these guys. Show up here in 10 minutes. Or walking down the streets and somebody you ran into before jumping out of an alley, or who knows what. It's just always on edge, always on edge. And I talk sometimes about cycles of poverty and cycles of bad decisions. I remember the example always sticks out on my mind. I was working at that steel mill, and my car, I hadn't paid for, I don't know, my insurance or something. And so I got pulled over on my way to work. And I got a ticket for not having insurance. Well, I can't stop going to work just because I got a ticket for no insurance. So the next night, I'm driving to work again, and I get pulled over again. Did you get your insurance? Nope, I didn't get my insurance. Okay, well, now you're suspended. Now here's a ticket for not driving with insurance and driving while suspended. Well, I still got to go to work. So I take, there I am driving the next night, a week later, and pulled over again. And that sounds crazy probably to all of you, but see, back then at that time in my life, I got pulled over every other day. Like it's not that big of a town, Eugene. Like, they knew who all of us were, and they knew the cars we drove, and they knew we were into trouble. And if it was Wednesday and I didn't get pulled over, I knew I was gonna on Thursday. It was almost an every other day occurrence. Like, it was cat and mouse. It was what we did. Like, they thought if I pull you over enough, I'll catch you for something because I know you're doing stuff. And that's how I lived. So now I've got, I don't know how many tickets for driving with no insurance and how many tickets for driving while suspended and now I'm getting tickets for driving without a license because I'm suspended. And I got $5,000 worth of fines and I still got to get to work. What are you supposed to do? Like, what you're supposed to do is not make a mess of your life like that so you don't get into those situations. But when you're in that situation, it feels helpless. It feels hopeless. And you get so far down the rabbit hole that you're just like, I might as well keep going. They'll give me tickets until they throw me in jail and impound my car, and I'll do 30 days, and then I'll get out, and it'll be done, and I'll start over again. That's what you think. And hope that you don't get an assault charge on top of it while you're there. And that desperation and hopelessness, there's something like that in those cultures where the meanest, most dangerous people you encounter in those subcultures are not the people that are the best trained fighters or the biggest or the lift the most weights. The most dangerous people in those cultures are the people that just have nothing to lose. They just don't care. And it's why Erica could be 85 pounds and dangerous as any man that I ran with. Because when you have nothing to lose, when you have nothing to live for, you just don't care anymore and you just go crazy. You just literally go wild. That's the place where we were at. And so now we're married and we started talking. What happened was a girl that was my buddy's girlfriend got pregnant and he split on her. And I had some kind of code of honor that made me feel a little responsible for her. Like I didn't feel responsible for her. I just felt bad for her because he was my mate and he just did her dirty. He just got her pregnant and split. I was like, that was a bum move to do. So we gave her a place to stay at the end of her pregnancy. And she had her baby, because I had a room and I could do it. And so we let her stay there. And she had her baby and then she wanted to party. Like she hadn't drank for 3 months at the end of her pregnancy and she just wanted to go out and party. She's just a kid. And so she said, hey, will you watch the baby while I go out? And we're like, all right, whatever. So she would go out and then she'd ask the next week and then she'd go out and she would stay gone for a couple of days and we'd be calling her and be like, where are you at? Your baby's here at my house. And it just got more and more until she would be like, can I leave for a week? And we'd be like, I don't know. All right, I guess. And finally we were like, why don't you just leave him with us and go do what you want to do? And she, so we had this little baby staying with us. His name was Eric. And at the same time that we were keeping that baby, there was a gang from California that came up. Some of the people in our gang had been from their gang, and leaving a gang is like, it puts you on a bad list. Like you're not allowed to leave. It depends on the gang, depends on the situation, but generally it's a bad thing. Your old crew is mad at you if you relocate or if you go somewhere without permission or without working through the proper channels. So some people left and we were a different gang than they were, and so there was bad blood. But these guys in California were a different deal, and they were going into people's work and pulling people out and beating them on the streets, throwing bricks through windows and showing up with guns. It's kind of a different deal. So things were really tense. And I always had a gun with me at that point. We highly prized like fighting. Like we were fighters. We took a lot of pride in our prowess as street fighters. Like if we had a problem with you, we were gonna fight. We weren't gonna shoot your house. We had this kind of like code of honor that we were fist fighters. But we all had guns, but guns were for home protection. But now people are getting their homes threatened. So I always had a gun close at hand because I didn't know when they were coming by my place. And people had been driving by and there was suspicious stuff happening. And I remember coming home from work one night and Erica the baby was in a car seat in front of the hallway. And Erica was sitting on the couch. And I was like, babe, you can't leave that baby there. If somebody comes busting through this door, he's right there. And she's like, okay, well, where should we put him? So we move the car seat and over here, and we walk away, and we're like, well, no, that don't work, because if they throw a brick through that window, he's right there. And well, we can't put him in that. Like, there was nowhere safe to put the baby. And it was like, well, what kind of life are we living that we can't even take care of a child? And we started talking very serious to that point about leaving that culture. And there wasn't, it wasn't about, like, it wasn't any sense of shame or repentance or anything. It was just, I didn't want to be crazy anymore. I didn't want to live that kind of life. It's just exhausting. The problem for us in leaving our gang was that if we did, it wasn't so much that we had a problem with our gang. We had the clout where we could leave. The problem was, if you leave your gang, you leave your support network. And we had a lot of enemies. We had a lot of people that didn't like us, and we were pretty well known. And if you have a problem and you've left your gang, you have nobody to call, nobody to help you, nobody to back you up. But on the other hand, we were also dead tired of, like, these, one night you're out risking your life for a guy, and the next night they're all fighting with each other over some girl, and you're in the middle of some love triangle trying to figure out whose side you're on while they're about to kill each other over some girl that just blew through town that nobody even knows. And, like, it's such an unstable environment, and the stakes are so very high. And it all just finally starts to dawn on you. This is a stupid way to live. Like, how did I get here? I remember waking up hungover one morning. There's beer cans all over my house, stumbling through, looking for a half-burned cigarette, and sitting down on the couch and just hacking up a lung and lighting a cigarette, and finally feeling some sense of relief and having some tobacco with a hungover head, and just thinking, how on earth did I get here? The memory of my life, like, from being a kid, like this little good Baptist kid, to waking up in a trash heap with a bunch of drunks, scrounging through the floor for a half burned up cigarette so I can have some sense of relief with my head swollen. And just thinking, what? I couldn't even retrace the steps. I remember very distinctly, how did I get here? And I didn't know. It just was like, almost like it happened to me. And so that's the phase of life we were in, and we were deciding about what to do. And back at that first time we had talked about when Eric and I first got married, and I was like, we were talking about whether or not we should stay or go or grow our hair out or what. And I remember back then we were like, well, it was like we didn't have any other identity then. I told Erica, well, if I was to grow my hair out, like, how would I wear my hair? Like, what kind of clothes would I wear if I didn't wear skinhead clothes? Like, what would we do? Who would we hang out with? Who would our friends be? Like, how do you make a life different than the life that you have? Like, where do you start that process? How do you make those decisions? And it just seemed kind of like paralyzing, so we just kind of forgot about it and kept going. Well, now the situation with the baby happens, and we're married now, and it's like, no, we got to figure this out. If we want our lives to be about anything else, like, we're married now, if we have a future, it's going to have to be under a different premise. And so we had been hearing all these stories about this gang up in Portland, a very big gang, much bigger than ours, probably 10 times bigger than ours. But there's 2 hours difference, so there wasn't a whole lot of back and forth. But it was people that had taken Erica in, so a lot of people we knew. But they had beef with us. I don't even know why, but every time we ran into somebody, they were like, oh, Rose City said they're going to kill you if they see you. It's like this on-site stuff, like, don't ever come to our town or we'll kill you. And half of that's bluster and half of it's real threat. And you're never quite sure which is which. And Eric and I decided, well, if we're going to get out, then we got to deal with this Rose City thing. Because what I don't want to happen is we leave, we're cool, like we have a baby 3 years from now, and run into a group of guys somewhere and they jump us in a parking lot with our baby. Like, I don't want that. So if we're going to have problems with them, we'll have problems now and get over with it. So there was another show up in Portland. And it's the kind of thing that you just don't go there without permission. And we certainly wouldn't have had permission. So we drove up there this night, and we came in late to the show, and it was a very big theater. And we walked in, and it's like a movie. I can see it in my head. We walked in, and we walked into the middle of the dance floor, and like it was like this Red Sea. Like people just parted and got out of the way as we walked into the middle of this dance hall, and then they all just stood in a circle around us, and everybody was whispering and like, I can't believe they're here, and all this stuff, and you can hear this chatter. And Eric and I just stood back to back, and we expected to be jumped by 100 people. Wasn't the first time we'd been in that situation, but these people knew how to fight, and it was really dangerous. And a whole group of kind of like the leadership of that gang came up, and I thought, well, here we go. And he said something kind of crass to me, and I said, look, we're going to grow our hair out. We're leaving the scene, and I heard you guys have a problem with us, so if we have problems, let's just deal with it now, because when I leave here, I'm done. And he said, man, you got a lot of gumption coming in here. And he stood there, and I was just waiting, like it was one of those moments, it's just on the threshold of like blowing up. And just when I expected we were going to fight, he put out his hand as a gesture of reconciliation and shook my hand, and he said, you're all right. You're all right with us. See, in that culture, there's so much of like bravery is the ultimate virtue, and to do something insanely brave, like gives you clout with people. And they just thought it was so wild that the two of us would go in there. It bought us enough credibility that they left us alone. And so that was done. So now we could leave. And so Erica and I, we started changing. And about this time, right, not long after that episode, I was at work. I had changed work at this point. I was working at a group home, and Erica called me one night. I worked night shift, so it was the middle of the night. And she called me, and she said, Matthew, something happened. I was like, what happened? She said, God spoke to me. I said, oh yeah, what'd he say? She said, he said he loves me. I was like, what? She told me this whole story of what had happened. It was a very intense environment. She had been involved in this occult stuff. Crazy stuff was happening. And she got to a moment through all this stuff that happened in this evening, just crippled and paralyzed by fear, and afraid that everything was crashing in spiritually around her. And in that moment, everything cleared away, and she heard what she understood to be God saying, I love you. There's a lot more to that story, but for the purposes of tonight, I didn't know what to make of that. So I'm on the phone at work. God loves me. And I was like, okay. I mean, I've told you that before. And she's like, no, you don't understand what I mean. I mean, God loves me, and I know that. And I was like, Erica, I don't know what you're trying to tell me. What do you want? Like, what am I supposed to do with this? And she's like, I don't know. You're the Christian. What are we supposed to do with this stuff? And I said, well, I don't, do you still have that Bible Grandpa gave you? She said, yeah, I think so, somewhere. I said, well, why don't you start reading it? I was like, do you want to go to church? She's like, I don't know. I was like, well, find that Bible and start reading it, and we'll go to church. She's like, okay. So I went home. She starts reading the Bible. My car's broke again, of course. And so we walked to the closest church. The first night Eric and I went to a church service, it was a Wednesday night, and there was like 5 or 6 70-year-olds in the sanctuary. And they started praying in tongues and hooting and hollering. And the place was empty. And I was like, we are out of here. This is not my cup of tea. So we bugged out of there. And I was like, we're going to have to find a Baptist church. Those people I know. It's just a little bit further to walk up to the Baptist church. So we started going to the Baptist church. The first time the Baptist preacher came to my house, I was in a tank top with a shoulder holster and my 9mm, and I answered the door. he had his little daughter. His name was Pastor Kaminsky of Westside Baptist Church in Eugene. And Pastor Kaminsky had his little daughter as I answered the door with a gun, and he said, "Hi, do you remember me?" And I said, "Yeah, you're the preacher from that church." And he said, "Yeah, we were glad to have you last Sunday. I just wanted to stop by and say hello and get to know you. Would you mind if I come in?" And he came into my house with his daughter, with me wearing a gun, and smoking a cigarette. He sat at my table, and I stood by the vent hood, because I'm respectable, you know, and blew my smoke up the vent hood while we talked. And he took a real interest in me. He was a sweet man. He was a good man. We started going to that Baptist church, and Erica started changing. She did start growing her hair out. I did too. We started trying to wear normal clothes, and she started listening to Christian radio, and she heard about this summer camp for foster children that a church was putting on, and so she responded to that and went to this church to talk to these people about being a counselor at this camp, Christian summer camp for foster children. This was not the kind of thing that we normally did. And she was really she was becoming a soft person. She was developing a soft heart. She was starting to care about people. She was starting to be kind and wise, actually. And she started reading the Bible a lot. When we got married, she was working at a group home, and and she called me just after she went back to work after our honeymoon, what honeymoon of it there was, and she'd been hit by an old man, and she was upset about it, and it was a fifth stage Alzheimer's unit. The guy didn't even probably know who she was or that she was there, who knows what. But it's not like she was mad at him. She was just mad at the situation. And I told her, I said, "Well, hey, you're my wife now. Just come home. You don't have to work." She's like, "Really? Is that a thing?" I was like, "Yeah, I'll work. You stay home." That's how it was with my family. She's like, "Okay, sweet." So she quit, came home. But then she didn't have anything to do. So before a Christian, she'd sit home and day drink and watch soap operas and hang out with the dog till I came home from work. And then when this experience happened with her and God, well, that didn't work anymore. She didn't want to do that anymore. So she would sit and read her Bible. Let the dog out in the mud just to have something to clean up. And we would talk about the Bible a lot in those days in our early marriage. It was, almost every night I'd come home. It's just the two of us, and we'd sit and talk about the Bible. We were starting to go to this little Baptist church. The preacher was coming around a lot. And she would ask me questions. When she first started reading the Bible, she read through Matthew. And of course it was King James, because I was a Baptist, a good Baptist. So she read through Matthew, and then she read through Mark, and she started in on Luke. And I came home from work, and we were talking about the Bible. And she's like, "Matthew, is the Bible just the same story over and over again?" I was like, "No, try Romans. There's different stuff in there." And so she started reading Romans, and then what happened was I came home from work one night, and we ate steak all the time back then. And we were sitting down to have steak and potatoes like most night, and she said, "I want to talk about some stuff." I was like, "Okay." And she pulled out a notebook, and in her notebook she'd written down probably, I don't remember, it was a page or 2 pages of Bible verses that she'd written with her own hand. And I knew that represented a lot of work, because she wasn't using no strongs. She wasn't cross-referencing. These were things that she had come across, and she'd been looking at this stuff for a long time. And I read through all these verses that she'd written down. And they were what you'd call like the conversion passage of the Bible. If any man be in Christ, behold, all things are made new. Children of the light, children of the darkness, all this kind of stuff. These passages in Romans, like that's what all this stuff was. And I said, okay, well, what's your question about that stuff? And she said, with no guile, she said, there's something different about me now. I don't think that I could do the kinds of things that we used to do. But you did all those things and you were a Christian. And I don't understand how that's possible. And I said, well, I was backslid, but we're okay now. We're going to church and things are good and we're returning, like we're doing the right things and it's okay. And once saved, always saved. And I asked Jesus into my heart already, so it's all cool. Don't worry about it. And I don't think she was convinced, but for the first time, I wasn't convinced. And so I remember after that night, 1 John 1:6 became like my enemy. If we say that we have fellowship with him and walk in darkness, we lie and do not the truth. And that thing just like kicked around in my head nonstop. It was there when I went to sleep. It was there when I woke up. I had a really boring job at that time. I was working in a cabinet shop for a motorhome company, and I would just sit for 8 hours and run a palm sander and think about that verse nonstop, all day, every day, and I couldn't escape it. It just was the only thing in my head. And the reason it bothered me so much, well, there's two reasons it bothered me so much. I was telling somebody the other day, revelation is not a new idea. I mean, there are revelations that are new things, like John has a revelation where he sees new things, but generally, scriptural revelation is when you finally see something old.
Yeah, amen.
Peter says, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus says, this has not been revealed to you from men, but my Father from heaven has showed you this. It's knowing something old the way it was supposed to be known. And that's why that was bothering me. Because see, when I read that for the first time, I probably memorized that when I was a kid. But now, it was like a mathematical equation. If you say that you have fellowship, plus walk in darkness equals liar. And I fit every piece of that equation. I said I was a Christian, and I knew that I walked in darkness, and the only conclusion I could have was liar. And I felt like for weeks, I just had this voice of God stuck in my head saying, you're a liar, you're a liar, you're a liar, you're a liar. And I wrestled and wrestled with that. And I didn't know what to do with it because my head was so messed up from the stuff I learned as a kid. I didn't know how to put it together. I didn't know how to make sense of what God was telling me now and what the church told me when I was a kid. I couldn't put the two together. And so I was struggling and wrestling with this and trying to figure out. And I finally at a place where I don't care what I have to do. I just want to quit being a liar. Like, I got to get real with this stuff. And I remember sitting and thinking about this stuff and trying to work it out and trying to figure out how to make sense of this. And it occurred to me a couple of things. And it was over a process of time, but it was very punctuated. The first thing was like, whatever I've learned about Christianity up to this point in my life has done me absolutely zero good. Like less than zero good. It doesn't done me a bit of difference. For all the good my life has done out of what I learned of as Christianity, I might as well not have learned it. In fact, if you had raised me as a Buddhist, I'd been a much better person if I was raised as a Christian. And so whatever Christianity was to me at that point in my life had zero effect. So it's either wrong or what I know about it is wrong. Because that can't be the case. Like, Christianity either has to be a falsehood, or if it has any real effect, it must be something different than what I've learned about it. And then I started thinking about this belief premise, like believing in the facts of the gospel. And I was sitting at my table and I was looking at my door and I said, I believe that door is made out of wood.
And that fact has as much value to me as believing that Jesus is the Son of God. Like, it's completely immaterial. It for all of the belief, it means nothing. And I thought, if it's not a scam, if it's not a lie, if it's not a falsehood, if Christianity is true, then there must be something personal about it. It must be, and I remembered all the like religious language I grew up hearing as a kid about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And see, to me, that was just like, that was Christianese. That was the way Christian people talked. Like a lot of things, like fellowship, or like, you know, all the terms that we use that are just like, they only exist in our culture. Like, you can't use them out in the world. People would know what you're talking about. Like, I don't know. You know what I mean? Just like the way Christian people talk in Christian circles. It was just one of those things. Like, personal relationship with Jesus Christ just meant like, be a good one of us. And I thought, well, what if it's more than that? What if that personal relationship stuff, like, what if Christianity isn't about the history? What if it actually does mean you can have a relationship with somebody? And I began to think, well, if Christianity works, it has to be that it's about somebody instead of something. And the next thing was, well, the devil's belief, like, if you grant the biblical story is true, the devil believes all the things that I believed up to this point, and he's no more a Christian than I am. So belief in these facts don't work. So how do I get access to him? Is there access to him? And this is the place where Jesus finally became real and somebody instead of this historical figure. And I had real experiences and encounters with Christ where he really met me and started to shape me, started to interact with me. I began to feel the presence of God. I began to connect with him. And then things started to change. Then it was like the lights were on. Then like all this old stuff from my childhood started to make sense. All these terminology, these scriptures, all this stuff that I had, like, it was just like flotsam and jetsam. It was just debris in my mind and in my life. And all of a sudden it started to animate and come to life and be something. And now I cared. And now things started. And the first experience that I had when I knew things were different, I went to a party. Eric and I it'd been a long time since we'd seen any of our friends, and we were kind of bored, like, because we didn't have any friends. Like, we'd go to church on Sunday and we'd see Brother Bob and Sister Susie, but then we weren't going to see him again until Wednesday night. Like, I didn't have anybody in my life. It was just work and go to church on the weekends, and we were bored stiff. We didn't know what to do with ourselves. And so we finally got so bored, we heard that an old friend of ours was having a party, and we're like, hey, maybe we'll just go see. I mean, it's been 6-8 months. We could stop by and see what's going on and say hello to people. And so we did. And so we stopped and saw our old friends. It was nice. I mean, they were drunk, and I didn't have any desire to do that anymore. But it was nice to see our old friends and catch up with people and, hey, how you been, and all this stuff. And, oh, hey, I haven't seen you in forever, all that stuff. And I went outside to smoke a cigarette. I was still smoking, obviously. And I stepped outside of the door, and there was this little patio and a bunch of steps that went down and like a pit driveway. And it was crowded. There was just room for me to stand just outside the door. And I lit a cigarette, and I didn't know these people. They didn't know me. There's nobody I'd seen before. And the guy standing directly across from me was drunk. And he said, hey, man, can I use your cigarette for a light? So I handed him my cigarette. You know, you use the end of a cigarette to light your cigarette. And he lit his cigarette and then threw my cigarette on the ground. He was just being disrespectful. He was just being a dumb drunk. And everybody kind of snickered. And I laughed. But while I was laughing, I had all this, like, I had this thing run through my head. Like I don't know how to describe it.
All the gears started.
All my gears started moving, and I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to kick this guy in the stomach.
He would go back in between that rail, and then I would hit him in the head. He would fall back there. I'd jump over the rail on top of him and start beating him. And that happened in a second, like in less than a second. All that went through my mind. And I knew that's what it was going to do. And so when I smiled and laughed, I was laughing about what I was about to do to this guy. And this is a familiar thing. Like it's how you start to act when you do a lot of this kind of stuff. And so you think through those things, and then there's like a trigger that happens, and you spring and you jump into action. And so all that went through my mind, and then there was no trigger. And I felt like I was shocked. I was surprised. I was like, where's the trigger? How? Okay, go. And I couldn't go. And there was nothing there. And it freaked me out. Like, it freaked me out a lot. I was like, what is wrong with me? Am I going to let this kid disrespect me? Like, he doesn't even know who I am. And I just, like, I was just shocked. And I opened the door behind me and I went back inside and I was like, okay, we got to go. And after I thought about it, I was like, that's what Erica meant. I couldn't do the things that we used to do. It was gone. I just didn't have the capacity for it anymore. That was my first experience with new nature. I think that's probably a good place to stop. I think that when I read Romans 6, I know exactly what he means to be a servant to sin. When you are a servant to a sin, you are free from righteousness. Nothing about righteousness got in my way. My morals were gone. My ethics were devastated. And my behavior was deplorable. I was completely gone. I think about it sometimes, those people that we hung out with back at that point in my life, they were like Erica. They had come from broken homes and broken places and broken situations. They had been broken their whole lives. And if you were to write out the story of all the people that I hung out with at that point in my life, and you would say, this person, he went through this is what happened in his family, this is what happened in his early childhood, this is what happened in his life, this is where he ended up, and he went to jail for the next 15 years, you'd be like, yeah, okay, well, it's probably what would happen from that life. But I didn't have one of those stories. I was an upper middle class kid with two parents who loved him his whole life, spanked me when I did wrong, didn't when I didn't, were kind, gracious, taught me the Bible, never saw my parents fight, never was abused, never had anything wrong. And there I was in the same place as all those people who were broken from the time they were born till the time I met them. And I think that what that means to me is that I'm a different kind of broken than that. Because I chose to be that way. I wanted to be that way. I developed a set of skills to allow me to be that way, very purposefully. And that, to me, is a different kind of depravity. And in our early years, when we became Christians and when I call it radicalized, we started embracing the Sermon on the Mount and head covering, and modesty, and all these things that we started doing. People from that phase in our life were like, what are you guys doing? You are off the deep end. Nobody's like you. Why are you being so crazy? Why you got to take it to such an extreme? Why you got to be so carried away with all this stuff? Can't you just be a normal Christian like everybody else? Like, why has it got to be such a big deal? Why is it all the time? Why is it the only thing you'll talk about? Why? Just chill out. And I always would say, it was so easy for me to be wicked. I was so good at being horrible. Until I'm that good at being a Christian, I can't be happy with myself. I can't be content. I want to be able to serve God as well as I serve the devil. I'm still, to this day,
I still have a long way to go in that. Until my Christianity is as natural to me as my sin, I don't want to stop. That's what's got us from there to here. Thanks for listening. It's good to share those stories from time to time. And I think, what values have for you. It's good for the saints to hear one another's stories. But more than that, the thing that I think that my story can value the church in is that sometimes I meet people and they seem so broken. They're divorced or married, or they're caught up in addiction. They seem hopeless. And I don't think that anybody is hopeless, because I'm quite sure if there was a way for me to make it from there to here, there's a way for anybody to make it from there to here. Let's give thanks to God, and then maybe we'll close with a song. Heavenly Father, I want to praise you for the ability to testify. I want to praise you, Father, for the goodness and the patience that you treat men with. I want to praise you, Father, for how you woo men and call them and love them and are long-suffering with them. We know, Father, that no greater love hath any man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. And we know that it's a rare virtue that men will die for another man. But we were enemies of God. While we were yet enemies, Christ died for us.
Thank you, Father.
You're so gracious. And you're so merciful. And you're so condescending. You come so very low into the worst of places. Your arm is long and your love is great. And we worship you, Father, for the things that you do with men and women, how you call us and save us and redeem us. I thank you, Father, for the things in my life that I have no right or claim to. My place in the church, the peace in my life, my children, my marriage, my brotherhood, my work, everything I have, Father, all of it comes from you. And I bless you for those things. In Jesus' name, amen.